I should also say that I've had a couple of connectivity problems with Zoom this morning, so if we all crash, we'll reconvene. Welcome everyone to this week, Reimagining Church in a Changing Culture. Keith and I are super excited about this week because we have some really great speakers for you, which we're really chuffed to have kind of caught to come and talk for us this week. So I hope that you enjoy it as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we move on to the introductions, just so that everyone gets a chance to say hi. There are a range of students on this course. We have possibly a majority of Matic students. Hi. We have a couple of Maycal students, as we were just talking about, and we also have some auditors. So welcome. If this is your first ever experience of Sarum, you're extremely welcome, and we hope that you will enjoy this first taste of the Sarum learning experience. If you are a Matic student doing one of the 3 courses, I am your tutor for this week. If you are an auditor or a Maycal student, Keith, who's there on my screen, is your tutor for this week. Please make an appointment with one of us for your tutorial. If you have not done this already, you need to do it now. Our tutorial slots are on Wednesday afternoon this week or on a subsequent week. So if you feel as though you'd rather listen to all the talks this week and then go away and have a bit of a think, and then get in touch about your essay, please do that. Or if you want to just get it in early, please make an appointment for Wednesday with one of us. In terms of the kind of technological side of things, I see that lots of people are just in Zoom mode already. If you're not talking, please mute yourselves so that we avoid feedback loops. As hosts, Keith and I also have the power to mute you, so if there's a lot of feedback coming from your end of things and you haven't noticed, we might just mute you. And also, if you feel the need, please turn off your webcam for a bit. So it is really good if we can all have our webcams on at least part of the time, so we can all see each other and have a bit of a sense of being together. But this is a long week of teaching, so if you need to take a break from being on screen and just want to listen for a bit, that's absolutely fine. Just switch off your webcam and we'll know that you're listening in the background. That's it for me. I just want to briefly introduce myself before I hand over to Keith to introduce himself, and then we're all going to just have an opportunity to say hi. And what we're going to ask you is who you are, although your names on the screen are a bit of a giveaway, and what drew you to this particular module, what you're hoping to get out of it. I'm Ellie McLaughlin, for the people who haven't met me yet. I'm the program leader for the Matic side of things at Sarum. I do systematic theology with some historical input and some, mainly systematic theology with a little bit of other stuff here and there, interested in the 20th and 21st century mainly. And I'm very interested in the intersection between the secular and the sacred, the church and the world. So this is really up my street, what we're going to be talking about today. Keith, over to you. You're muted, Keith.
Yeah, I just realised. Hi everyone. So I'm Keith Elford, and especially warm hello to those I've not met before. I'm the head of the Maycal program at Sarum. I, like Ellie, actually are relatively new to Sarum, but enjoying being with you all very much. I'm an Anglican clergyman. I have also been a kind of management consultant for a long time, and my particular interests are in the intersection of ecclesiology and organization studies, and I hope nearly finished a PhD thesis on that theme. So that's kind of where I'm going to come into this particularly, but I have a very broad interest in the relationship between church and culture as well. So yeah, looking forward to this very much.
Great. I'm going to call on people based on where they are on my screen. So Linda, over to you. Can you just tell us a sentence or two about yourself and why this module is interesting to you?
Right, I come from a church called St Andrew's Church in Northumberland. I'm a lay reader, but I'm also an ordinand on a bespoke training programme. I've tried out some of the Sarum College modules earlier this year, really enjoyed them. I found that I'd learned a lot from them. So when I saw this one, there are quite a few areas that I'm really interested in. So I thought I would sign up for this one as an auditor.
Oh, great. Thanks, Linda. Well, I hope you learned some more this week. And thanks for joining us. Pete, over to you.
Hi, I'm Pete Butchers. I'm in West Sussex, just on the South Downs. I'm a Baptist pastor, and before we were here, we were in South America working in church planting. So the whole thing about culture and church, and especially right now when we get a chance to throw the whole thing up in the air, is very exciting. I'm not sure some of my church members feel that, but I do, so that's great. So this has come at a great time for all of us, I think, to rethink and reimagine church.
Yeah, that's really true, that we're in a very specific point in time, aren't we, about thinking about where the church can go from here after such a long period of having to adapt to the pandemic. This is an interesting point and an opportunity to think further about how the church might change and develop. Thanks for that. Helen.
Hi, I'm Helen Jessup. I'm from the Isle of Wight. This is my fourth Matic module, and my background is from nursing. I know very little about the area we're looking at this week, yet again, and I'm looking forward to the module. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Helen. Mary, you're next on my screen.
I'm a Matic person as well. I'm my second year, and I could just say there wasn't a lot of choice of modules, but that would be unfair, wouldn't it? This one does actually interest me. It's one of the ones I would have put at the top of my priority list, because in our church we have a weekday evening event that we call church, and so I'm interested to know whether that's the right label for it.
Oh, that's intriguing. You're going to have to tell us more about that group at some point this week. Thanks for that. Jane, over to you.
Hi, I'm in Salisbury, just up the road from Sarum, so a little bit frustrated that I can't just stroll down and be in college. I work in education. This is my second year of Matic, and a little bit of, there weren't many module choices left, but I'm looking forward to it. Especially looking forward to Anthony Reddy on Thursday. I think that'll be really good.
Yes, you're right, that will be really good. I should have mentioned actually that we've had to swap over the Thursday morning sessions, and you'll have seen if you've checked recently on Sarum Learn, SST is running this week, the Society for the Study of Theology, and Anthony hadn't realised he had a clash on Thursday morning, and he has to be at SST first thing, so he's going to join us for the second Thursday morning slot, and our more kind of seminar discussion sessions will be first thing Thursday. Right, thanks, Jane. Susie.
Hi, I'm a lay minister at my church in Greyshot, which is on the Surrey-Hampshire border. I work for a Christian charity called Military Ministries International, working with Christians in regions like the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, where it's very dangerous to be a Christian, let alone a military one. And so this module was absolutely top of my list of all the modules I could do this year. And I'm really excited about what will come out of it, that I can use both for my church as we try to reimagine how we can be church for our community after COVID, and for the ministry to individuals in those difficult areas.
Oh, great. Thanks, Susie. Rosemary, you come up next on my screen.
Hello, I'm Rosemary Peacock. I am a Roman Catholic from Romsey, very close to Salisbury. I have no official leadership position. I've been retired from work many years. We have an aging population, an aging congregation, and I think this will possibly help with ideas as to how to keep young people practicing. And that's basically why I want to do it.
Thanks, Rosemary. Yeah, that's such an important conversation to have, isn't it? How we can sustain intergenerational church communities. So yeah, we can definitely bring that up in our conversations. Thank you. Michelle, up to you.
Good morning. I'm a second year Makehouse student. I've just completed my curacy and looking for my next post. I've tried to do a master's a couple of times before and for various reasons haven't been able to. And although that was very frustrating, actually, I think God was really in that, because if I'd have done one, I wouldn't have been doing this. But every single module has been amazingly pertinent to what's been going on in my church at the time. So yeah, every module has just been perfectly timed. So I am looking forward to seeing what this one relates to, and the subject of leadership is really important to me, to lead well.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really helpful. Maybe you could record yourself saying every single module has been extremely pertinent to my learning and just put that on the SAM website. That'd be great. Catherine, you are next. You're muted, Catherine.
Sorry. Catherine, coming to you from Belfast in Ireland, and I'm currently on sabbatical from my job in the media, and I've done a few of these modules, and looking forward to this one because I think it's particularly pertinent to, I suppose, the overlapping of church and the wider community here in Northern Ireland at the particular time.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. We're glad you can be with us for another module. That's really great. Jeff, over to you.
Hello, I'm also a Matic student. Nice to see a lot of my cohort. I'm coming to you, I'm ashamed to say, from a rather sunny Jersey. None of this cold and wet and snowy on the ground. I've been for a nice bike ride this morning and had my breakfast outside. So I'll just get that off my chest first. I am very keen on this module. It was on my hit list for doing Matic, because as a pastor of a local Anglican church, I have seen that the church is very good at being a membership club shaped by its past, but not so good at being there for the rapidly changing world around us, and interested in where that's heading towards rather than where we're coming from. And I have to say, I'm especially interested in the Bonhoeffer module.
Oh, that's good. We always like a bit of interest in Bonhoeffer. Thanks for that, Jeff. Paul.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul. I'm a parish Anglican priest in Bedfordshire part-time, but also have diocesan responsibilities for helping churches to grow. And so I'm focusing particularly on this module because of its relevance. I have a sort of a long-standing interest in ecclesiology, and looking to find and experience ways of structural reformation in the church and what the future will be like. And a part of that has been exploring ecclesiology and how people have understood the church in the last sort of 100 years or so. That's been something that I've been very interested in. So there's lots of connections with the module.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Paul. And it's good to have you with us as a new first-time Xerum student. Femi, over to you. You're muted, Femi. You need to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So Femi is a Pentecostal minister, and also doing a program on Christian spirituality, Sharon. My interest really, I'm very interested in this imaging to find out how the relevance of the church in the modern world now. What's exactly church is doing? How do we relate church to community? What's happening? So from the aspect to learn from some of my to incorporate the teaching of Lord Jesus Christ. So maybe in the process I will learn a lot. I'm just very, very interested in it. I don't know, but I'm keen.
That's great. Thanks, Femi. Okay, Michael, and then we'll end with Judy.
Hi, my name's Michael Jones. I'm joining you from Dorset, just outside Bournemouth. I'm a Quaker. I was an elder of my local meeting for about 5 years. That finished at the beginning of this year. I've been doing the Exploring Theology the last 2 terms, and I've signed up for the 3rd term. And I'm intending, I want to join if I'm allowed on, because I'm not actually a graduate at all, but I'd love to do the MATIC course, the Theology, Imagination and Culture. That very much appeals to me. This module strongly appeals to me as well, because British Quakers have been talking for decades, it seems to me, about how we can be more open and welcoming to everyone, and yet we're still just overwhelmingly white and middle class, and you know, I don't really know entirely why, and I just love things to be different. We're also aging, like a lot of churches, and my own meeting has no children and no young people, but I'm one of the youngest. I'm 58, so that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Michael. And if you're interested in doing the MATIC degree, we need to have a chat at some point. So do be in touch, and we can talk about that. I'm just kind of noticing how wonderfully ecumenical we are as a group this morning, which is really enriching, I think, for our conversations this week. So that's a really great thing. Judy, let's finish up with you. You're muted, Judy.
There you go. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yes, I'm a lay minister in Trowbridge, in quite a big Anglican church. We've got 3 churches with varying sized congregations. This module really lights my fires as well. This was the kind of, for me so far, it's the penultimate module. This is what I'm really interested in. So my interest is really more about fresh expressions and pioneering, how we can bring the kingdom into the community as church, because I don't think we're particularly good at it, and how we can collaborate and not collide with culture, because there just seems to be, when we, you know, people who certainly I work with, they find the whole issue of culture quite a challenge. I guess my passion is to see the church transformed and to be the bride who he is intended to be. And one of the things that I've been looking at is we're going to start a ladies' shed in our church as part of a kind of a fresh expression, in association with a men's shed. so that we can, so the church actually is much more practically engaged in the community. And I'm a bit of a risk taker, so I think sometimes I'm the proverbial thorn in the flesh in our PCC, because I can guarantee that if anybody's going to take a risk, I will. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I want to see, I mean, somebody talked about the relevance of church in the modern world. You know, if we're not relevant, then we're just a club, aren't we? And we're just an inward facing club. So I want to do the things that Jesus said to do, and that is to go into the community and go into the world and work with other people.
Wonderful, thanks, Judy. We're going to be passing over to Keith for the first session. But does anyone have any burning questions before we kick off this week? I don't see anyone frantically signaling to me. So I think we have one new person. Morinike, are you able to?
I think that's Femi rejoining on the laptop.
Oh,
it's Femi. That's
excellent.
It's showing the name of my wife. I don't know why.
Okay, wonderful. I'm glad you're back with us. Wonderful. All right, Keith, over to you for session one.
Here we go then. I'm going to share my screen. I've got to bring up my. Let's see if I can get this. Okay, are you seeing that, everybody? Just wave positive. Yes, that's a few nods. Yeah, excellent. The title for this session is "How has the Church been imagined and reimagined in the past?" Which is not a bad title, but I suppose the principal focus of it actually is for us to ask ourselves, do we know what it is that we're trying to reimagine, and are there limitations on what we can do in order to reimagine the church while remaining the church? And I suppose the answer to that, as soon as you put it that way, is I guess there has to be something which is core and which must be preserved, and things which are less core and perhaps can be changed. So what I want to do is just kind of start to unpack, think about those kinds of things. And I want to get you involved as soon as possible, because you're going to have plenty of time just looking at the screen and taking stuff in. So I want to try and get you engaged. And I have a picture for you coming up now. Oh, the background there, by the way, is my own parish. That is St. John's, West Byfleet, where I am the interim priest in charge. Here we are. This is also a church that's relatively near me. So I'm in Surrey, in Guildford Diocese. I suppose technically I live in Addlestone, although it feels more like the next town. And this is the sign that appears outside Addlestone Methodist Church. And it has always intrigued me. It's been there for a few years now. And I'm particularly interested in the way that they describe themselves as a congregation of ordinary people who try to live by the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. There's been a vogue, hasn't there, for mission statements and straplines and all that. And I guess this is theirs. But what I want to do to get us going, you might just want to take a note of this, actually, if you've got a pen handy, because I'm going to have to come out of screen sharing in a minute. It's that phrase, a congregation of ordinary people who try to live by the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. You might want to take a note of that, because I've got a little task for you, which is simply to have a conversation about what you make of this as a description of a church, or indeed the church. And I'm going to put you in groups of 4 or 5 for 5 minutes, and I'd like you to return ready to share your thoughts. time is not exactly with us for this first session. So when you get back, I'll probably ask you to be as concise as you can. But I want to try and use this as a way of getting some of the issues on the table. So is the task clear? Okay. Well, one or two people have nodded. Judy, I'm taking you as representative of the whole group, because I can only see some members of the group just at the moment. So I'm going to come out of screen sharing, and I'm going to put you into breakouts and give you 5 minutes. Okay. And it's completely random. Here we go. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Okay, now I've done what I did on the last time I did this, which is not take a careful enough note of who was in what group, because I was busy sorting out bits of admin with Ellie. So there was a group one. Do you know if you were in? Would you remember if you were in room 1? Jane, you were in room. Oh, well done. Perhaps somebody then would just report on the conversation from room 1. Perhaps it's going to be you, Jane.
I think Jeff should do it.
Oh, okay. Go on then, Jeff.
Thanks, Jane. I'll remember that. I mean, interesting, lots of discussion, a recognition that producing a strapline for a church is itself a really challenging exercise, because it has to communicate both within the church community and on the outside of it. And we felt that things like a congregation and of Nazareth weren't necessarily words that would be understood by the wider community, but they communicated a nice humility by saying they were trying to live by the teachings of Jesus and were ordinary people. But it brought us back, and we brought in a number of other straplines from other churches to this fundamental challenge. Who is this message for, and how is it heard and understood by people within and outside?
Okay. Thank you. Who was in room 2 then? Pete was, wasn't it? Rosemary, yes. Who's going to speak up for room 2 then?
I can speak up for room 2.
Come on in, Pete. Thanks, mate.
Well, just we recognise in defence that you can't put it all in a sentence. But for the prosecution, we wouldn't probably put any of those words in the sentence. I wondered myself whether we could just replace it with gardening and Alan Titchmarsh. You know, we're trying to garden like Alan Titchmarsh does and hoping we get somewhere. It's not very aspirational and not very creative and not very cosmic. But they had a good go, I guess. I didn't like it. I don't know if that comes across.
Thank you, Pete. Anybody want to contradict Pete or add to him from that group? In that case, that just leaves the final group, which was room 3. Who's going to be the spokesman for the final group, or spokesperson, I should say?
I nominate Susie.
I think Susie or Michael.
Susie, you might be. Sounds like you're nominated.
I'm just trying to remember everything Judy said. Okay, well, I raised a question about whether it should be Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth. That was an interesting conversation we had. We noticed that a notice board is trying to communicate more to people outside the church than people inside the church. We liked we're a group of ordinary people trying to live by Jesus' teaching, and just sort of noticed in passing that the easiest way to sum up those teachings are Jesus's two commands to love God and love your neighbour. Anyone else want to add anything? Judy.
Yeah, and also that Jesus said he came to redeem all of creation. So there's something for me about it's important for the community to see that we care about the same things as actually most of them do, about, you know, how we treat the environment and how we treat other creatures, and obviously how we treat each other. And I think somebody said, you can't imitate someone you don't have a relationship with, and we never really got a chance to explore that, but that's absolutely true.
I said it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got something there about what's the relationship of this group of people to the Jesus named in the statement. Jesus of Nazareth, who is he? And Jesus Christ might be a better statement. It's quite static. I mean, yeah, we're followers, but it's not very clear there's nothing much in there about what that means, whether it means loving one another, or it means loving others, or whether it means having some kind of aspiration towards the state of affairs in the world. But there is, you know, it's one line, strap lines are difficult, and there is something quite appealing about the you know, the humility of it. Is that a rough account of what's been said? Okay, well, look, I'm just going to go back to my slides and make a few more comments. Okay, well, thank you for that. Let's find it. I mean, as I said to Ellie in the gap, I find this statement both appealingly humble and utterly inadequate at the same time. And it seems to me that it's got all the deficiencies that you mentioned, but I think what might be at the heart of it is a failure to convey what I would regard as an adequate view of what the church is. Now, all this is terribly unfair in a way, because this is a statement, you know, which is meant to be attractive to the public and all the rest of it. But if one is reading it as an ecclesiological statement, then it seems to me not to really capture what the church is. So let me move on and ask a bit more specifically what it is that we are reimagining when we're talking about the church, and say that this is not a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. And actually trying to answer it has been a particular preoccupation of theology or ecclesiology in the 20th and 21st century. And it's interesting to note, I think, that ecclesiology really emerges as a discipline in the 20th century. I mean, because, and so the extract from Stone's reader in ecclesiology says, because it was really from that point onwards that the church ceased to have that taken for granted existence particularly in European environments, and started having to justify itself alongside other organizations and other claims to authority and so on. So this question of what the church is becomes much more urgent in environment where secularism is growing, where ecumenism is much more of an issue, and so forth. Now, we know that there are some normative statements which we can turn to if we want to talk about the church. And you know, we can talk about the biblical images that are commonly quoted and often considered in this context, the most notable one probably being body of Christ. But there's also people of God, you know, living temple, various others. And for a very full account of those phrases and what their ecclesiological significance might mean, the classic work is Paul Meniere's work, which is referred to in the bibliography at the end here. We also have doctrinal normative statements in the form of the Nicene Creed's description of the church as one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. But actually, all those things are great, but what's quite striking is that that's not a lot in a way. And that we can, I mean, it is in some ways, those are very big statements in those images and in that Nicene statement, but they don't help us to very clearly, work out what our kind of model of what the church is and how it might work, what that might look like. And it seems to be a fairly agreed feature of late 20th, early 21st century ecclesiology that there isn't really a normative ecclesiology, and that by which I mean a kind of accepted model of the church in the way that there is of the Holy Trinity. And I'm drawing particularly on Nicholas Healy's work there, and as I will be throughout this presentation, but I don't think he's out on a limb when he says that. Healy actually is a Roman Catholic source, and so is Roger Haight, who I'm mentioning next, who points out that I mean, you might disagree with this, I think some would, but there's a fairly clear statement by Haight, which I personally would support, that the New Testament does not offer a clear account I mean, clearly there are statements about the church, but there is not a very clear model of how the church works. And one of the things that Healy suggests is that the 20th century has been characterized in part by the desire to create a kind of supermodel of what the church, of what the ecclesiology might look like. Many have been proposed, but here's the quote: "None has been defined or received as the most basic and fully adequate model. Scripture contains a variety of ecclesiological models, and it is far from clear which ecclesiological idea or image has primacy." Now, given all that, it's probably not a surprise that Addlestone Methodist Church and many other churches have struggled to summarize the nature of the church in a line or two. It is not easy. So no agreed model. A lot of work searching for a model. One influential example, which I'm sure you've heard of, is the well-known book by Avery Dulles, Models of the Church, published in 1974, revised a couple of times since, in which Dulles identifies 5 different models for what the church can be. These are not exclusive models. These models may coexist. So one may see in any particular church things, so they're kind of like typologies almost, really, so that you might see more than one at work in any given church. But the 5 models that he started with are church as institution, where there's a very strong, that will involve a very strong emphasis on the formal structures, offices, etc. of the church. And I suppose, without wishing to caricature, that might be a kind of elements of that certainly in the Church of England, but it's been very strong historically in Roman Catholicism. Mystical communion, so the church is a body of people who are united in a mystical, unseen way with God and therefore with one another. Particularly strong in some Protestant circles. Church as sacrament, that is the idea that the church is the embodiment of Christ at work, that the people and the institution embody a spiritual understanding. Or herald, a church being a body that has, or entity that has a message for the world, a message from Christ, a message of salvation, or servant, the church as a entity which is there to serve particularly wider society and to support causes which that service might lead them to support. In later addition to the book, Dulles added the notion of community of disciples. My sense is that the book is not hugely valued, though, and its findings not hugely respected amongst ecclesiologists, because I think really because the book lacks a very clear theological rationale, and it's not really supported by any research. So it's a bit speculative, but it's been very influential. So I'll move on from that and talk about the search for a model in another way. And I don't know if any of you actually read the free reading which I provided. If you did, you will have read this chapter of Healy's work on the church world and the Christian life, in which he, and I think his phrase here has been quite influential, and his thinking's been quite influential. So Healy talks about the tendency in the 20th century for blueprint ecclesiologies, as he calls them. And he describes them in terms of these different elements, these typical elements in the list here on the slide. So a single phrase metaphor is often a dominant idea within what he calls a blueprint ecclesiology. And the body of Christ is probably the most often used. The bipartite structure. So most of these blueprint ecclesiologies and 20th century ecclesiologies make a distinction between the mystical church and the empirical church, the spiritual church and the institutional church, if you like, the church you can see and the church you can't see, the visible and the invisible. And Healy's concerned about the consequences of overly distinguishing between those two things. There is a search for a normative ecclesiology. I suppose that's by definition part of this activity. And this is where the concerns come in. He notes a tendency to see the church in terms which abstract it from its concrete identity. So the church is presented as an abstraction, and a mystical conception of the church has the disadvantage of being somewhat abstract. And finally, in consequence, a tendency to produce an idealized account of the church. Now, why would that matter, do you think? I'm just asking that as an open question, just for a moment or two's conversation. What's at stake if we idealize the church? So I'll just stop sharing for a moment so I can see you, and just invite any comments on that, or any responses to that question. Michelle?
If you idealise the church, then people come assuming that they have to live up to a particular standard, and if they can't, then that could exclude them, make them fall away, become disillusioned when they see that nobody else is even living up to that standard either. And I think it just creates a huge gap between the life you think God wants you to live and the life you are really living.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts?
It tends to the idea that you're dealing with a completed thing rather than a work in progress. And the nature of the church is that it is being shaped rather than shaped.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. That's a good comment. There's an over-realized eschatology, I guess, is one way of is a way of putting it. If the church is on a journey to the eschaton, the trouble with idealizing it is it means the rest of the journey is hardly necessary, really. I mean, all that's true. I mean, I have one or two specific things in my head when I put that question up there. It seems to me to have relevance to what has been a very major issue in the church in recent years, and a very major issue if we are trying to cross the boundaries between the church in contemporary culture, and that is the whole history in relation to safeguarding. It seems to me that one of the big issues in the whole safeguarding scandal is quite likely to be a tendency to idealize the church, which makes us, I think it makes us less likely to recognize our sin, basically, our sinfulness, and makes us more vulnerable to the kind of shortcomings that result when we're not very realistic about what the church is actually a collection of sinful people. So I think there's quite an ethical, what I think I'm saying is there's quite an ethical driver there around not having that overly realized eschatology and not idealizing the church. But as soon as you place your primary focus on a relatively abstract conception or an invisible conception of the church, and underplay the empirical church, you are in danger of doing that. That would be my point of view on that. So I'm just going to go on back to my presentation and move on and just pick up this key issue, which is what in the last slide it was called bipartite structure, but Healy calls it elsewhere the twofold construal. That is seeing the church as having these two dimensions, this spiritual dimension and this human dimension. And there's a quotation here from Claire Watkins, a paper she wrote some time ago now, but still relevant, I think. She refers to it as the problem of talking about the church as properly both social system and mystery or body of Christ. And quite a lot of ecclesiological energy goes into trying to resolve that. That is at the center of the question is at the center of quite a lot of 20th century ecclesiologies, I suppose, as Healy's remarks about blueprint ecclesiologies would lead us to suppose. Part of the issue around these ecclesiologies is that in the absence of the kind of definitive model that has been historically established and can be clearly rooted in the scriptural witness, then you get people. What happens is that people develop their proposals around the church based on their more fundamental theological ideas. That's what Kelsey is saying here. So Healy quotes Kelsey. I really like this, so I get this in quite frequently. But Kelsey thought that every theological proposal involves a kind of single synoptic imaginative judgment as to what the whole Christian thing is fundamentally about. And the issue and the difficulty around that is that although there are a number of fundamentals, if you like, that probably most Christians agree on, or certainly a wide range of Christians would agree on, there is no single shared theological horizon because there is such diversity, such a kind of legitimate diversity within Christianity, and also the presence of a lot of non-Christian specific elements in the way that Christianity is being developed. And one thinks particularly of the early influence of Hellenic culture and so on. And so what Healy goes on to say is that our doctrines of the church, probably the word doctrines there is wrong. I should have said models or understandings or frameworks, because it's not really a doctrine we're talking about, reflect general theological agendas. And so depending on what your more broader theological agenda is, you get a version of what you think the model of the church is. And I think Healy's view is that we can't really avoid that, but we need to know that's what we're doing. So here's a ridiculously whistle-stop guide to some prominent 20th century ecclesiologies. And I'm really trying to illustrate how the fundamental ideas that these theologians have influenced their conception of the church. So Barth, this is calling once again on Claire Watkins. For Karl Barth, the church is based on the word of revelation, which calls the community into being. As such, the church is sustained by a secret other power, which cannot be sociologically expressed. Okay, so the otherness of God, the complete dependence on revelation, which is characteristic of Barth's theology, results in a view of the church as a very itself an other community, relying heavily on the other life of God, and therefore not to be seen primarily or even very strongly as a sort of sociological entity. Or take someone like Brunner, from a very similar idea around revelation, a different conclusion. So the church is still special because it's a kind of community. It's a sort of other mystic community, but it's also got a human structure, and one can see the two things as somewhat distinct. And one can divide the essential church from the institution which kind of carries it along. And then one comes to someone like Bonhoeffer, and I feel enormous trepidation talking about Bonhoeffer in the presence of my colleague, who knows a great deal more about Bonhoeffer than I do. But I do understand Bonhoeffer, and I'm very strongly attracted myself to Bonhoeffer's view, that for Bonhoeffer, the church, which is understood to be God's new will and purpose for humanity, is not an abstract or idealized concept, because Christ himself has entered into history in order to achieve that redemption. And therefore, as it puts it there, God's will is always directed towards the concrete historical human being. So this kind of social concept, which is at the heart of Bonhoeffer's thinking, is of the church as the body which both embodies that speaks to the world of the destiny of all humanity redeemed in Christ. But this is not this is not a sort of invisible concept. It's a concrete human society, and I guess it's a kind of sacramental conception, and one that I have quite a lot of sympathy for. So those are just examples of how fundamentally about different ideas that as starting points can get you to different places, and sometimes even a similar idea as a starting point can get you to different places on the church. If we follow Healy's conception, we will want to put more emphasis on the concrete church. That is the church as we see it in the world, less, and in a way that's less preoccupied with trying to distinguish between its spiritual and its human or social dimensions. What Healy wants is for us to focus much more on the church as we actually see it at work, and as it actually is in experience. And for him, it is true that it is the church's theological distinctiveness that makes it special. But the church is shaped and influenced by history and culture. So for Healy, the church has does indeed have both this spiritual and human dimension, but is created as it is in these concrete terms by its coming together. So we cannot separate the spiritual and the human in the church any more than we can easily separate the spiritual and the human in the individual. So if we say that I as an individual or you as an individual are transformed by the presence of Christ and by your participation in Christ, we believe that, we live on that basis, and we hope to be able to see that in terms of what comes out of your life over a period. But we can't see the join. I can't say, looking at Michelle, because Michelle, you're on my screen at the moment. I can't say, looking at Michelle, which is the spiritual bit of Michelle and which is the human bit of Michelle. You're just of a piece. You're one, as far as, certainly as for my perception. And I think Healy's asking for that in our perception of the church. And he feels, and this quote at the top is important, because if we do not do that, we really risk undervaluing the theological significance of the genuine struggles of the church's membership to live as disciples within the less than perfect church. So if we have a kind of spiritual church floating above a kind of a sort of human shell, we really take theological significance away from that lived experience of Christian faith in the church. Haight talks about the church having two relationships which define it, one to God and the other to the world. This means that the church does not have an existence independent of the world, so that from an independent position, it may then enter into a relationship with the world by choice in order to engage in mission or whatever. What Haight is arguing is it's actually the relationship to the world alongside the relationship to God is what constitutes the church. It is that body of people who have that dual relationship. And on that basis, the church can be looked at from above, theologically, and from below, sociologically, and historically, culturally, etc. I think it's fair to describe this understanding that emerges in those works, which, I mean, and of course, there are plenty of other understandings around, but I think it's probably fair to describe that as broadly a sacramental understanding of the church, and is interestingly pretty consistent with the conclusions of the Archic II conversations on the church between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. And there's a reference there that you can follow up if you wish to. I think this is pretty well this is very near my last slide. Yeah, how are we doing? We've got a little bit of time, we're doing well. I mean, a pretty fundamental, and this is a link, this starts to be a link to the later session I'm going to do on leadership and organization. I mean, just to step forward to that session, a perspective I would bring to this whole question of reimagining the church would be a belief or a conviction that we need to be very clear on the church's identity, partly in the terms of the kind of church's nature, which is what I've been talking about, but also in terms of what the church is for, the church's purpose, what the church is trying to do in the world, or is here for. So I think just the last bit is just to do a bit of reflecting on that. I'm drawing here on some work on an essay by Paul Fides, which you'll find in the references, in which he talks about, he's talking particularly about the relationship between ecclesiology and social sciences broadly and social science research broadly. But it kind of covers most, I mean, it works, I think, too, for most questions of human science and so on, and history and culture. So if we want to say that the church is grounded in the nature of God, which I guess we do, according to Fides, it means that the story of the church is nothing less than an engagement in the meta-narrative of the Trinity. I'm slightly paraphrasing him here, which is why it's not in quotation marks, but quite a lot of his words are in here. It's an engagement in the meta-narrative of the Trinity. So in other words, at the very heart of our theological conception is a notion of God as Trinity, as creator, as redeemer, as life giver, who holds the world in his or her grasp, but is also present within the world, both in that particular incarnated way, but also through that participation, which is the Spirit's mode within the world. And that leads to, and all that arises from the narrative of God's revelation in key moments in human history. The story, essentially the story told in Scripture. And when we put that all together, it leads to a kind of sacramental understanding of reality in which God is encountered in an embodied way through concrete realities and not merely through ideas. And so what this is discouraging is an idea that there is a sort of abstract spiritual world floating above again, and a kind of ordinary world sinking somewhere down below. Faith takes bodily form in the life of a community as people live together. And those communities cannot operate without some kinds of institutions and structures. So for Fides, what ecclesiology should be about is the theological dimension in these embodied forms. But that takes us back to somewhat to the H quotation from the earlier slide. But it also opens up a conception of the purpose of the church, which in Trinitarian terms, to be a sign, instrument, and foretaste of the life which we share as God's people in the Trinitarian God, but which of course is for the world as a whole and is already at work in the world as a whole, and which has been revealed to us in Christ. Now, I hope, one, that this has helped you to see, not, I'm sure you knew already, but has added some content to the recognition that the statement of Adelson Methodist Church missed quite a lot of what one might want to say about the church. But I hope also, and I've included in the module an essay question which picks up the question I'm going to ask you now, which just picks up the issue that I think is really crucial for reimagining the church, which is put slightly more bluntly than I put it in the interview question, which is this: what can and what cannot be changed if we are reimagining the church? And a clue to the dimensions of that question would be that your answer is quite likely to vary, not just according to how you understand the church in the terms that I've been talking about, but also where you see the given by God and where you see the human. I've argued for seeing the thing as a concrete whole, but different churches actually have different perceptions of what is given and what is changeable, what is not changeable, and what is more contingent and therefore changeable. So I'm just going to come out of that presentation now and suggest that we just spend the last few minutes talking about that last question. What limits are there on what we might be able to change in order to meet the present situation we're in, the issues around young people, issues around the culture that we're part of. And hello, by the way, to the people who have joined us, since I did see your names popping up, but I decided to leave all that to Ellie as I was going. But anyway, welcome. Is it Don or is it James? I've got slightly confused.
It's Don.
Don.
Yeah,
hello,
yeah.
hello, Don, and hello, Simon. I'm not going to put you into groups again, I don't think. I'm just going to suggest we have a few minutes of general conversation. So any thoughts either on the question I've asked you or anything else that I talked about? Mary.
One thing that's going through my head is to what extent all this about relating to God and relating to culture would apply to other institutions that are not Christian. So Judaism, Islam, would not the same sort of arguments apply there? And if so, what makes it church as opposed to mosque or whatever?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm sure there are many common elements in the kind of considerations that you'd have to go into. And I don't feel that I know, Islam or Judaism well enough to really comment. I suspect that the Trinitarian understanding that I was outlining, however, is unique to Christianity, and that has implications which would not be there for, say, Islam. Any other questions or thoughts or picking that up? Ellie, please tell me I wasn't too wrong about Bonhoeffer.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just picking up on Mary's point there. I think something that sometimes gets lost in interreligious dialogue is just the fact that, just as within the Christian tradition, there are a multiplicity of understandings of what church is or should be, or what its job is, what its role is in the world. So within Judaism and Islam and other religions, there's a multiplicity of understandings of, what the mosque is there to do in the town and how it should relate to the people that, live around it. And depending on who you ask, what is a mosque, you'll get so many different answers. And perhaps that's something that in our mutual stereotypization, if that's a word, of other religions or a-religious people of Christianity and our stereotypical views of other religions, we kind of lose that depth, perhaps. So I think your question reveals the breadth of understandings of breadth of ecclesiologies and the breadth that is within other religious traditions as well.
Yeah, good point.
All right. Yeah, I'd like to contribute two things which are related. One is to say that I guess it's something I've been looking at for a long time now, but I would like to suggest that there is what I call a fundamental DNA of the church, and everything changes in the church, but in fact nothing changes in the church because of a fundamental DNA, fundamental principle, which I think is based around three things. I mean, we could go on to talk about what we mean by those things, but it's about fellowship, worship, and mission. And I'd relate that to something else, which is, again, I think, the terminology of a blueprint, which is where you went to, and then starting off with models, those two things are really quite different. They're not the same. It's in my way of understanding it, so it's the way Dallas understands model. The theoretical model is there to enable you to engage with complexity and enable you to actually point to particular things. It's a model. That's all it is. It's not saying, well, this is how it is. It's a model. And then from that model, you then create another kind of experiential model. Well, what does that mean in practice? So the idea of creation of models and what models are, I think is fundamental. If you're going to talk about Dallas, it's not the same thing as a blueprint. A model is not created as a blueprint of this is what you need to be doing. And that's why in Dallas's work and in other people's work, you have a number of models being mentioned, because each of them have their weakness and each of them have their strengths. And then also the model that we might be applying at this particular moment in time is determined by where we are historically and culturally. So the movement from an institutional model much more to the idea of a community. Would be one way of expressing that.
Yeah, I mean, you might have a blueprint for, you know, if we're going to start getting into that, you might well have a blueprint for making something like a model aeroplane, you know, and then which would be a model. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point that there is a distinction. I did say typology, didn't I? I mean, I think I only really meant ways of looking at it, and I think that personally, I think that Dulles' work is quite helpful for the reasons you've said, but I don't find many ecclesiologists saying that many nice things about him. Jeff?
This language of models or types is all very static, and I wonder if what really matters is the direction of travel, that there is no such thing as the biblical model of church, and we're seeking something that doesn't exist if we're looking for what that perfect type would be. The world around us is dynamic and changing. Community is dynamic and changing. Individuals are dynamic and changing. And what's important in all of those, and I suspect in the life of the church at any one time, is the direction of travel towards a deeper, richer experience of being in the kingdom of God, of living in obedience to God, and of allowing that to have expression in a way that impacts people beyond and outside of the church. So I'm just worried about this seeking after a static definition when actually I don't think God's given us one, and I don't think we're called to something which is a dynamic invitation rather than given a definition of what we are to be.
Yeah, and I think that is the, in a way, the burden of what people like Healy and Haight are saying, that they're, you know, if we focus all the time on trying to find this kind of, you know, model or framework which is definitive, it won't help us as much as we think it might. And actually looking at the church as that community of actual, you know, the actual community that's actually living with God is more kind of productive. I think that's their perspective. But I mean, these are issues with quite practical implications. So, you know, if you have one view of the church, so let's suppose you think that the orders of ministry, you know, the orders of ministry as found in the Church of England or in the Roman Catholic Church are part of the basic structure. I mean, a part of the given of the church. Well, then you know, so you've got to have bishop. You know, to be the church, you've got to have bishops, priests, and deacons, which would be a kind of, it's not an Anglican perspective because the Church of England has them, but recognizes them as, you know, a good thing, but not essential. But the Roman Catholic Church would regard them as essential part of the given structure of the church. So, I mean, or for example, take the question of church buildings. We're used to hearing, aren't we, that the church is the people, not the building. We hear that all the time. But we're living with the fact constantly that for huge numbers of people, actually, the building is really important, including the people who we want to appeal to, who are outside the community, outside the church community. If the church is the concrete combination of both spiritual and human context and experience that I was talking about for some of that, well, then maybe the church building is actually important. Maybe the building is part of the church. Maybe by saying it's just the people, we're losing something quite important, because we're talking about something that's embodied in fact, in history, in culture, in context, not just a kind of, you know, a slightly abstracted human community. So it does have implications. Michelle, you had your hand up for a while, haven't you?
This might be really oversimplistic, but what keeps going around my head is that saying, all Alsatians are dogs, but not all dogs are Alsatians. And in that sense, you know, church can all, you know, all churches are church, but they all look very different from one another. They're all different breeds, aren't they, of the same type of thing. And in that, as I was thinking
they're
it
all
through,
canine, yeah.
As I thought it through, I thought it's not about location. It's about context, because, like you said, to some people in a particular context, the building is of huge importance, but in another context, the building would bear no relevance whatsoever. So can it be defined by context, and is that actually what this whole module is about, rather than it being defined by a definition or a specific model?
Thank you, Michelle. I find that enormously helpful as a way of thinking about it, and I think, and I'll pick this theme up in my later talk, but I do think that the church is the result of a kind of conversation, interaction, or dialogue between the Christian community and its context, and behind that there is a kind of dialogue or conversation between the spirit and the human as well, and it's actually, there is quite a degree of contingency and contextuality in the way that the church both is and indeed should be. Yeah.
Judy, I see you have your hand up, and also I see that we're at 1 o'clock. So shall we just wrap up with Judy's question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody said earlier that church is about fellowship, worship, and mission. And I think congregations and people outside the church, let's not pretend that everybody outside the church doesn't know those words, because some of the people outside are those who are so disaffected by the church that they've given up. And others have got relatives who've given them these words, or friends. But what is the understanding in each individual church? Because if you take the word mission, you'll find that congregations agree with mission, but how to execute it and you know what that means in your community, there is so much disagreement, in my opinion, about how you do it and who does it, and you know, are people specially gifted to do it, and shall we just chuck some money at something, or you know, not, that sounds very flippant, I don't mean it to be, and also that the direction of travel of any particular church is, I think, is dictated by a number of things. So it's perhaps the type of church, the leadership, you know, your leader, your minister, your vicar, the congregation that you've got in your area, so the culture of your area, and all of the other things. And we talk so much about a white Western picture of what church is. And actually, if you go somewhere else in the world, they don't recognise it. And actually, why should they? So we're kind of at the beginning of a very big subject and broad subject, but those things seem really important.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is that the contextual challenge which we face is greater than the church is of a scale, you know, on a scale that's greater than the church has faced for a long time. And that we've been quite slow to respond to it, and so the gap, as it were, keeps getting bigger. On the question of worship, fellowship, and mission, I think, yeah, there are issues of definition around those words. My other issue with defining the church in those terms is that these are functional definitions. So it says that the church is here to do certain things. And one of the things I feel quite strongly, and I'll say a bit more about it in my next session, is that we have to sort out who we are before we think about our functions, and actually that by defining the church's life in terms of its activities is in danger of missing things of quite fundamental and indeed transformative importance. So I keep hearing we need to do more mission, and as soon as you start out on that track, it becomes something that you have to kind of make yourself do. I'm not saying that, Paul, you think that. I'm just talking more generally now, and I'll give you a chance to come back at me, in a later bit of conversation, I'm sure. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what is it that's we got inside, as it were, that's driving us, and what is it that we want for the world before we start worrying about what are the particular activities we need to do that are going to get us there. But I think we better stop there. I've used my facilitator's prerogative to get my last word in, haven't I?
The chair, it's the presenter's even privilege, isn't it, to have the last word. Thank you very much, Keith, for kicking us off on this week. You've given us already lots of food for thought as we go off for lunch. So we will resume at 2 o'clock. Please arrive a bit before that if you can, so that we can start the session promptly at 2, and we will have Professor Chris Baker with us at that point. So I hope you will have a nourishing lunch, some brain food, and we'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. It's a different Zoom link, so please go to the Sarum Learn website. You see all the links for Monday and click on the 2 p.m. link. All right, see you there.